Welcome to the Bridgehead with Jonathan Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 1380 at 3 o'clock p.m. My name is Jonathan Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half hour. Now, what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks is quite a bit different than what we have usually done. As everyone knows, the Bridgehead really focuses on culture, but we've generally focused on the negative side of culture. Now, we've tried to highlight inspiring stories and particularly noteworthy organizations like Operation Underground Railroad, like the efforts of Steve Maman to rescue Christians from ISIS in the Middle East. But for the most part, we haven't taken too close of a look at the positive side of culture, noteworthy literature, music, and art. And I figured, over the next 4 weeks, around the Christmas holidays, nobody feels like listening to an interview about the rise of sex trafficking in Toronto, for example. But people would probably rather hear a series of interviews on literature and on great books to read and really talented authors. So what I did was I phoned a number of prominent Canadian authors and put together a series on children's literature, because I thought that this would be a kind of a fun thing to discuss over the Christmas holidays. People are buying a lot of Christmas presents. People are looking around for books to read. So why not? So I'm interviewing 4 people over the next 4 weeks. The first one is Jean Little. Now, many of you will recognize her name because some of her books have even been assigned reading in Canadian schools. She was born in Taiwan to missionary parents in 1932, and she's written dozens of best-selling children's books as well as a couple of autobiographies. She's actually received worldwide recognition for a lot of her books, and she was awarded the Canada Council Children's Literature Award. And her most immediately recognizable book is her novel From Anna, which was published, I believe, in 1972. And she's the author that we'll be speaking with today. She actually lives in Guelph, Ontario. And the other 3 authors we'll be talking to, some of them will probably be very familiar to you. Kit Pearson we'll be talking to next week. She lives on Vancouver Island, and she's the author of a lot of brilliant books, such as A Handful of Time, Awake and Dreaming, The Sky is Falling. All of these were books I read growing up. And she has a real way of writing books from a perspective that very few other people have managed to do well. And then on December 31st, we'll be interviewing Gordon Corman, who's a hilarious writer. He's from the Toronto area originally and then moved to the United States, but he wrote his first book at age 12. This Can't Be Happening at MacDonald Hall, and then continued writing a series of really humorous children's novels as well as young adult novels, and eventually ended up writing adventure books like the Everest series and the Dive series and the Island series, all of which are very, very well done. He's definitely proved he's an adept writer and he can adapt his style. And the final interview in the first week of January will be with Lynn Johnston, who's probably immediately recognizable to most of you because she's the cartoonist behind the decades-long series For Better or For Worse, which follows a Canadian family, the Pattersons, through the different stages of their life. And she was very groundbreaking in terms of her comic strip because she was the first one to age her characters in real time. So I picked Canadian authors, not because I had to, but simply because I grew up reading these 4 authors. All of them, I think, have a lot of magnificent material, and a lot of them have material that's deserving of our attention. And I quite frankly think that with the rise of series, wildly popular vampire series and Twilight and all such things, that it's great to focus on children's literature that I think has true literary value, and that the content has things in it that I think are really worth reading. So I'd first like to introduce my interview with Jean Little, and I hope you enjoyed these discussions as much as I did. So a lot of your books, Mine for Keeps and From Anna, have been based on your personal experiences, both as someone with limited eyesight as well as working with disabled children. How much did your life inform your writing? Because some people say that most of their writing has autobiographical snippets in it, and some people say, I just made up a good story. How did your life impact your work?
I think you can't help but your life gets in whether you mean it to or not. Certainly mine has. But I haven't, was occasionally different. I mean, some books are more in, like From Anna certainly is very, very close to my life when I first came back to Canada from Taiwan. It's very autobiographical in a way, in lots of ways it isn't. But many are. Some are tied up. Like, for instance, I've written more than a couple about guide dogs because I have guide dogs. But the people are not. I mean, the main character, the dogs are based on dogs. Yeah, so they're based on autobiographical as far as the dogs are concerned, but not as far as I'm concerned. So I just, long years ago, Rosemary Sutcliffe, who's a British very well-known author, said to me, you write the book that comes to you asking you to write it. And that's sort of been, I've just, all of a sudden the book has kind of arrived in my head with usually the character has arrived in my head and then from there on. But it hasn't, I'm not the kind that, looks for the trends or what on the curriculum or anything like that. It's just whatever. So I don't, if you said to me you wanted me to tell you about for every book, I've had 53 or something like 53 published, and I suppose almost all of them have something in them that ties into my life, but not that I've sat down to do it on purpose. I have written a couple of autobiographical books that are about my own life, that say so. But and then one that is about my mother's life, from family stories and things. So those three, little by little, stars come out within, and then the one about Mother, His Banner Over Me. And it hasn't been published yet, but I have written a third autobiographical one.
Well, there's a few things there that I want to follow up on. I had actually wondered when I was reading through your biography some time ago when you talked about coming back from Taiwan as a little girl, because your parents, of course, were missionaries for the United Church over there. And then, of course, that automatically makes somebody who's ready to work think about From Anna, where a young girl comes to a new country, feels alienated, and, of course, struggles with a lot of the same things that you did. So how much was From Anna based on your experience coming back from Taiwan at a very young age?
It was based on, but I wrote the first story of it when I was just, I can't remember exactly, before I was 20, when I was a teenager. It was just a short story. And I didn't want to have to write about missionaries. I wanted to write about this little girl making a basket. I didn't want to have to put in all the stuff about Taiwan and all that stuff, but that wasn't the story. So I tried and thought of what, at that time when we'd had a lot of new Canadians in our life coming from Europe and other places. So I took a name from then. And so that part, the part about the background of the heroine, was not mine. But the part of her coming to Canada and all that was very autobiographical. And the basket I wove in that book is on display in the William H. Smith Library.
Okay. You said earlier that you don't write based on what the curriculum is advising, and I find that interesting because a lot of people have commented on how there's been a very distinct shift in children's literature over the last decade or more. One of the things that we see more and more are these almost franchise series and dystopian novels like, The Hunger Games and then the Divergent series. Yeah. And Do you see a major shift in children's literature? Because this seems a lot different than books, like Ella Montgomery, Louisa May Alcott, books by
Well,
yourself.
they wrote series. Both of those particular. It's just interesting you mentioned those, because I just finished reading Little Women, Little Men. Joe's. I read the whole. There were four of them in the
Good Wives.
Louisa May Alcott, and of course Ella Montgomery, the Anne books and the Emily books. She wrote series, but there's been a big space in between. I think perhaps, I don't know if they would admit it, those people who've been writing, but I think Harry Potter did a lot to spark them off, and anybody. I wish I did. Because I think probably they are very good at earning you money if you're very good at writing a series. But I have written linked books, but not a series. I've written more than one about the same characters, like a sequel, but not a series. I don't know. I do think that it's sort of fashions come and go. And right now, one of the fashions is to write series. As a lot of people are doing. I've noticed that, too. A lot of them. There's not just the Hunger Games and Harry Potter, but there's all kinds of others. And every time you turn around, there's a new one. And some of them are really good, and some of them are just a waste of space.
Yeah, and the reason I say franchise and not series is because they seem to be almost oriented towards a movie franchise, which most of them have been turned into at this point. Most of them have been turned into series.
Yeah, I never thought of that. But of course that's true. And if you get it started in a movie thing, and you go on, you know what though? People think that makes you a lot of money, and it really, in some ways, having your book made into movies, I think, detracts somewhat of, because of course people then watch. How often do you hear people say, talking about a book, and then you find out they haven't read the book, they've seen the movie?
Almost always.
That happens all the time. I talk to people about books, and when I get into it, and then I say, well, I really like this scene, and it turns out they have no idea what I'm talking about because that wasn't in the movie. It's really funny.
So you've been writing...
Harry Potter. There's a lot of people think they've read Harry Potter, and they have seen the movie, or think they've read The Lord of the Rings, and they've seen the movies. And it gives them, but there's a lot left out. We every Christmas we've had parties for many years where we read Dickens' Christmas Carol aloud, and over somebody would say, "Oh, I don't remember that," and it would be the part that wasn't in the movie. It was funny.
Well, and you've talked a lot about children's literature. You've taught children's literature at a university. What sort of shift have you seen in children's literature? Because you've been writing children's literature long enough to sort of see how the shifts have gone, and especially as this generation has a much shorter attention span, literature almost has to, unless they're forced to read it in school, almost has to compete with things like TV shows and movies and action heroes and things like that. What sort of a shift have you seen?
Well, you say that. That's interesting. You say that about a short attention span. Have you looked at the size of the Harry Potter books lately?
That's what made them so distinct, though, was that they managed to keep people engaged.
And there's hundreds of pages, and they're read. Kids read those books, so they do. And I get letters from children. I know what you mean. There are kids. I live with my great nephew who lives with us, and he's 19 now. He's at the 8th book. I think it's terrible. He hates books. He just likes computers. Doesn't like books. But I do get lots of letters from children that love books. So it's not just. But there are fashions that come, and there certainly are things that were not, that when Ella Montgomery wrote were not put in children's books, but that now are. Just the fact that they reflect society. When I wrote my first book, I never even thought about them. My mother was a doctor with a very busy practice, but the mother in my very first novel stayed home and did the cooking. And I never even crossed my mind that why didn't I have her give her a job like my mother? It never crossed my mind. And now, there's so many children's books where both parents are employed, and the world changes and the children's books change in reflection. So there's a lot of realism. There's also a lot of fashions, like vampires, or something comes along and then people pick it up, but they go out of fashion too. So in some ways it's good to write like mine, because my books are pretty realistic and I don't follow trends much, because I never even think about it. I just write, and so at least they don't go out of style, because they're never really in the latest fashion, so they don't go out.
Yeah,
but I do see it change as the world. But as I say, I think it does reflect the world that we're living in. Is reflected. Although the books from the kids read up till the time they enter puberty. The kids read below the age of 12-ish, kind of. Those are the same. They don't want changes in books much. If you're 9 or 10, you really want to read a straight story, a good story, but you don't need it to be in style. But then as soon as you get into your teens, that changes. So
yeah.
I noticed that.
Yeah, because it's interesting you bring up Harry Potter, because one of the reasons they were such a phenomenon and so many people wrote about those books was because they couldn't figure out what sort of formula J.K. Rowling had discovered that got kids to read so many pages.
I think she just plain loved it. She was into it, and I went to hear her speak when she was here at the Dome, right? And she was such a down-to-earth young woman. She was, of course, younger then. And I thought, well, I could have this person over to supper. We'd be perfectly comfortable. And she obviously was just, really involved. She just went and lived in it. It was her world that she lived in her mind. She had a grand time at writing, I think. But I liked her a lot. I wish I could. How sometimes you meet people in passing and you think, I wish they lived next door. Mm-hmm. That's the way I felt about her. She was just a very charming, down-to-earth kind of woman.
Well, what kind of children's books did you read? You just mentioned that you read, and I assume reread, the Louisa May Alcott books. What other kinds of books did you read?
I just did it on I have a Victor Stream, a little, like a Kindle thing, and I got all, and then read right through them. When I was a kid, I just read everything. I read through the children's library. I love The Secret Garden, and I was sure that somewhere in the library there had to be another book that good. So I literally went around. I read along the shelves, keeping track of which ones I had already read, looking for this book. And I never did find one quite as good, but I found some good ones. But I liked everything. I didn't read nonfiction as a kid, hardly at all. And I didn't read, mostly nonfiction. I read everything else. Everything. Didn't matter. Anything that came up. Fantasy, realistic things, I loved. It didn't matter.
Have you read any of the current Canadian authors that write the same sort of fiction as you do? Like,
oh, yeah.
Kit
Pearson, I've read all. I can't read print now, but when I can read them, if they're in talking book, and a lot of them are, like Sarah Ellis and Kit Pearson and all. Yeah, I read them all. Mm-hmm. And I think some of them are wonderful, wonderful writers. And when I was a kid, there were no children's writers except Ella Montgomery.
Right.
Wrote about Canada. I thought, and to me, Prince Edward Island was like a fantasy place. It didn't sound at all like Canada. Where, I lived in Toronto and Guelph, and they just didn't sound the way she made Prince Edward Island. So, but now there are lots and lots of books for Canada. The kids can, read about Canada all they want now.
I was going to ask that because obviously Canada has always been very focused on promoting specifically Canadian culture, Canadian books, Canadian musicians. So this has been something that's been very focused on, and we have a public broadcaster who is dedicated to promoting Canadian content. But, some writers will say, well, I wasn't writing specifically for Canada or specifically for the U.S. I just wrote a good story. Do you feel that you have a specific Canadian perspective that you're actually trying to, or it just happens that way because you happen to live here?
Well, I happen to live here, and I have placed the book. I remember with my very first book, Mine for Keep, I had the girl going to CGID without even thinking, and they wanted me to change it to Campfire Girls. and there were several because I had an American editor, and I didn't even realize when I was writing. I didn't realize that I never thought about these things being Canadian. They were just my background, and so I thought that was just, I took it for granted, and I did not change. I mean, she said to change that, and I said I can't. There's no Campfire Girls in Canada, and the book is set in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So we had it was quite a argument over that, and but I just wrote because the books were set in Canada. Because that was where I was at home, right? I just wrote about where I was at home. I didn't even think about that. But I did know that there was nothing, that I had never been able to read books about Canada when I was a child. I remember being very thrilled with one Ellen Montgomery book where the kid lived in Toronto part of the year. There's only one.
Right.
All the others are set in Prince Edward Island. But this one, Jane of Lantern Hill, Jane lives in Toronto. And I love that one especially because of that very reason. It was more like my own life.
Many writers have said that writing good children's literature is actually even harder than writing good adult literature because you have to sort of retain the ability to see the world through children's eyes and understand what they're feeling in situations, and that, you know, what seems to be a small situation to an adult can be enormous for a child. How have you managed to write children's literature that's sort of captured the feelings of children? And they say this all the time. It's one of the reasons that your books have won so many awards. It's, you know, you and Beverly Cleary and just really a handful of authors, children's authors, who have truly managed to capture the way children interact and feel about things. And
I think perhaps we're people who really remember our childhood. I mean, not the events so much, but how it felt. I certainly do. I remember very clearly partly because I was an outsider, because I was cross-eyed and I had all these things kind of against me and didn't see well, and I was just and because of that, I observed. You think, but I was always listening and without even thinking about it, I would think. And so when I began to write, I still had it all there, and I remember exactly how I felt as a child, and so I have no trouble as soon as as soon as the characters start moving around in the book, they just take over, and I don't write for. I never think now my readers won't like this, or I must make this easier so they'll understand, or I just really write. But I'm not somebody who says I don't write for children. I'm very pleased to write for children. They're a wonderful audience. I mean, they're very faithful. They are. I don't know if you realize, but you know how there's public lending that you get for your books being in libraries, and you get a certain amount. Children's books do better than anybody else's in that because the kids don't care if books are in the bestseller list or they stay in print, because kids keep asking and coming to get them. And they're the books their mother read and their sister read. And so my book, Mine for Keeps, I still get royalties for it. It's been in print now since 1962. And I got royalties for it just yesterday. And there was. I thought that's pretty good. Because there are a lot of books that go out of print, especially books written by adults for adults. They don't stay in print all that long.
No, children read and reread and reread.
They reread. They don't. They go back because they feel happy reading that. You know, I remember clearly when I would go back and read the books I loved, looking for the special parts that I really liked, and so on. Just lived in the books. My friends were the children in books, and there are a lot of kids like that, I think, sort of outsiders. Their whole world is the book world.
So
and you know what you were saying about the CBC? I was fascinated the other day. A book was mentioned, and somebody wrote into Sheila Rogers saying that some book was mentioned in an interview. I think it was with David Suzuki, and the woman went to the library to get it. And there were 49 requests ahead, 49 people on. She went, the same afternoon. She heard the broadcast, went to the library, did a couple of things at home, went to the library, already 49. So that's how when the CBC promotes a book, I mean, it's wonderful. And they have a children's book panel. I just wish they did more. It was a little longer because it seems to be very short. But it's wonderful what the support they give for children's books.
How has being somebody with limited eyesight, you're legally blind, but you can still see a lot of things, and you use a guide dog.
Now I can't. I'm sitting here right now, and all I can see at this moment is one light shining over to my left, and light coming in from a window. But I have very, very little vision, and I can no longer read print at all. I haven't for a long time now. But I still can read talking books, and I do constantly. And I read old and new ones, and I download them.
How has your limited vision sort of affected your writing career? Obviously, when you write something like From Hannah, it's very, very obvious. But obviously, it would affect it in different ways. And when you're reading the depth of feeling in a lot of your books, one sometimes gets the sense that you make up in sharpness of feeling while you're writing what you don't have in sharpness of vision and in sort of observing the world around you. How do you think it's affected what you write?
Well, I think partly that is somebody asked me once if I'd lived other lives because I could write about gardens and things I'd never seen, and I thought it was very funny. And I said, no, it's not that. I just read, and I read a lot, and so there's all kinds of things that I feel I know exactly what they're like that I've never seen because I've read about them, and I read widely, and I read constantly, and so the sighted world is available to me. Now, there are things I have to go and ask once in a while, ask somebody, can there be navy blue eyes? Because I never see eye color. And when I could see, I mean, I never did. And so I do ask sometimes, but mostly I don't know, I don't feel. There were things I couldn't see, of course, even as a child, but I didn't feel that it was I just lived in my world, and it felt like a perfectly normal world. And I had a very loving and interesting family around me, so that even though school was difficult, and I still had my sister, and so on, and we were, I don't know.
One final question.
I don't think about it that much. I don't try to avoid thinking about it.
Right.
But I certainly write a lot about bullies. I notice I must stop because I've got them almost, because I was bullied as a kid at school. Not the way you hear about now on the computer, but just people chasing you and calling names and things. And I've got that in book after book because I'm trying to sort of, I guess I'm trying to help kids to know that it's not just them. Maybe. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So one final question is, a lot of people dream of writing a children's book one day, and very few people actually...
Yeah, I meet them all the time.
Yeah.
They're always... Yeah, they come and they talk to me. I was thinking I should write a book, and I say, well, come back and talk to me when you've got the first draft done, because until you've tried to do it, you have nothing. I can say, I can't get... Well, couldn't you give me some tips? I said, no, I couldn't. How do I know? How would I know what kind of tips? I have no idea if you have any talent or interest or anything. It isn't. People, you'd be amazed how many people think they could do it. If they just, they're busy at the moment, of course. They go to the gym and they do this and they do that, so they don't quite have time. But as soon as they have time, they're planning to dash off a children's book. I think it's very funny because, of course, it's real work. I like it. It's work I love, but they think it's really easy.
Well, people think it's easier than writing an adult's book often, even though if you think about it for a few minutes, as I said before, it's a lot harder.
No, I don't think it is really. I think I think you write, and whatever you have the ability to do one or the other, and that's what you do. And I don't think it's probably all that much harder. I've heard people say writing a picture book was terribly hard, and I didn't write any for a long time. And I thought, I'm sick of hearing this. I'm going to try it. I don't think it could. And I've written, I don't know, about 6 or 8 of them now, maybe. And it wasn't hard. It was It was hard, like any good writing is hard.
Yeah.
But it was fun, and it wasn't harder. It wasn't the way they make it sound. Like every word matters. I think every word matters no matter what you're writing.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
It was fun talking to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Canadian author Jean Little speaking to me by phone from Guelph, Ontario. I hope you really enjoyed this interview, and I hope you join us again next Thursday afternoon for a discussion with author Kit Pearson. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great weekend.